Cizre in 1915.
Please.
Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sonar. I've created a handout with a map of the places that I'll be talking about, as well as some statistics from the 19th and early 20th century, just to give you an idea of the places that I'll be talking about today. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference. You guys have done a wonderful job, and actually we're quite sad that this is the last day, but hopefully there'll be future conferences where we will again meet and exchange ideas. I would also like to thank the Assyrian Foundation of America for sponsoring my attendance here and for always being supportive of my work. So my talk will have a brief introduction to the text that I'm looking at, as well as another section dealing with the narrative and the details in the poem, and then I'll be providing some historical context with some parallels and analysis, and then I will be giving my conclusions and final thoughts. So, in 2008, Swedish Assyrian researcher John Betsawoe visited Paris to interview elderly members of its Assyro-Chaldean community. While inspecting a collection of books and manuscripts at the Assyro-Chaldean Association in Sarcelles, he discovered two interesting Neo-Aramaic poems detailing events that occurred during the First World War. One of these, totaling 255 stanzas, was authored at Bedaro, near the city of Zacho, in 1916 by Chaldean Catholic priest Yonan, son of Abraham, and copied by Mattei, son of Sa'id of Asnach, in Erbil in 1990. Professor Joseph Yaqub identifies this text as Duriktat Farman, or the Laments of the Farman, by Core Bishop Yonan Bidawid. The other poem, containing only 65 stanzas, only bore the name Isha Shlemun Gharib, and it was therefore assumed that he was both its author and copyist. While recently inspecting some of the material that John had sent me back in 2009, I discovered that the shorter poem, copied by Isha Gharib, was actually an almost word-for-word copy of a section of the longer one by the priest Yonan, dealing specifically with the massacre of Assyrians in the district of Cizre during the summer of 1915. However, it included many variant readings, some of them more correct, as well as some extra stanzas. So as you can see here, the Isha Gharib manuscript starts with Tlathab Tamuz Yomat Eda, Sahdut Martoma, Sharnakhnaya with Lehjama, Legge Raktha Uqtallayl Alma. But the other manuscript has actually a better rhyme and a better meter. Tlathab Tamuz Di Leyoma, the Edet Sahdut Martoma, Sharnakhnaya with Lehjama, Legge Raktha Uqtallayl Amma. So I basically collated these two versions, as well as another two additional copies. And here I would like to thank Roni Eramia for alerting me to these two additional copies of the manuscript, which are of the longer poem, and they are also copied by Mattei, son of Sa'id, at Erbil in 1990. I wonder why this person would have copied the same very long poem at least 3 times, the same year in the same place. I need to research that more. But these were discovered in the collection of the Dominican Fathers in Mosul. So this paper will present a critical evaluation of the relevant stanzas of the priest Yonan's poem, which were copied by Gharib, as well as an analysis of the historical data presented in them. I have done a critical edition of the whole of the 65 stanzas that are common in both redactions of the poem. Please do not laugh at my critical apparatus. It's actually, I did it in a rush, but it's done and it just needs to be completed. So, it was basically to get a better reading. Whereas the priest Yonan's original poem is quite lengthy and begins with a general description of the First World War and its outbreak, the section directly copied by Isha Gharib begins straight away with the attack on the Chaldean Catholic village of Gerekfid Bedro by Kurds of Shernach on the 3rd of July 1915, the feast day of St. Thomas. On that day, the village headman, Musa, and 36 villagers, presumably men, were tied together and shot dead in the local church. The majority of the village's inhabitants, which numbered between 600 and 800 people, were similarly annihilated. On Friday, the 9th of July, the inhabitants of neighboring Taqiyan were also imprisoned and tied up in the village church. Their headman, Matlub, was tied up with 105 of his constituents, presumably again men, and led away to a nearby valley called Navala Qucha, where they were killed. Only a few inhabitants of this village, which numbered between 600 and 900 people, survived. The next day, the Kurds of Shernach assaulted the villages of Wasta and Tel Qabbin, where they conducted additional massacres. And Qaqos, the elderly headman of Tel Qabbin, was killed as he tried to evade capture. The inhabitants of these two villages were chased into the plain, and the Kurds of Shernach pursued them, gathered them together, and slaughtered them. The poem reports 30 people as having been killed from Wasta, which numbered between 500 and 600 inhabitants, along with half of those of Tel Qabbin, which numbered between 450 and 500 people. Here there is a divergence in the poem's transmission, as Isha Gharib's recension of the poem adds 2 stanzas regarding the village of Mansouriya, which he calls Masurika, which had about 360 Assyrian inhabitants and also appears to have been attacked on the same day as Wasta and Tel Qabbin. Here, the villagers were also massacred along with their headman Isaac and other notables who were deported in convoys. After this break, the narratives in these 2 redactions of the poem again begin to agree with each other, with only a few stanzas being misplaced or altogether omitted by Isha Gharib. On Sunday, July 11, for instance, the son of Musto, described as a butcher, Qassaba, crossed the great waters of the Tigris River and massacred the inhabitants of Peshabur along with their headman, the wealthy Jacob. The priest Thomas, only one of 2 priests in the village, was humiliatingly led along the riverbank and killed there. Only about 100 people survived from this village, which previously had a population of between 1,300 and 1,600 Chaldean Catholics. The survivors fled to Mosul after having hid themselves for some time with the Slavani Kurds. While no details are provided regarding the massacres in the towns of Cizre and Sirt, as well as other villages around them, the poem notes that the survivors fled to the lower country, presumably a reference to the Nineveh plain and Mosul, where the Christians had been protected from massacre. Now, after the massacre in the Navroi district, which is what the text calls those 4 or 5 villages in the district of Cizre, the Muslims then prepared to attack the Chaldean Catholic village of Bedaro, near Zaho, planning to pillage it and massacre its inhabitants. On July 10, word came from Zaho for them to evacuate, and in a panic, the majority of them fled to the town's Christian quarter, or Mahalle, taking only their children. The village was emptied in the hope that the police post in it would protect their belongings, but it was sacked and burned by the Kurds of Barzur, Chamishkyo, Bakarma, Salka, Kharabdar, Khelach, and Al-Farma, who carried axes and rifles, breaking the doors of the huts, killing those who had remained in the village, and pillaging it. After this, 1,000 Kurdish tribesmen from Shirnakh gathered near Zacho, demanding a payment of 1,000 liras, otherwise they would attack the town. As a result, Chaldean Catholic Bishop Jeremiah Timothy Maqdisi and his priests went to Zacho and sent a telegram to the Ottoman provincial authorities in Mosul, declaring an emergency and requesting aid. It was then that the Aghas of the town, Rashid, Abdurrahman, Muhammad and Hazim, sons of Shamdin Agha, intervened. They immediately armed themselves, manned barricades, and invited the Shirnakh Kurds to fight them. Seeing that the Aghas would not surrender the Christians, the attackers backed off and retreated. The town's Imam, Ahmad, then preached in the mosque that the killing of Christians was not allowed and the pillaging of their belongings was prohibited. In response to the telegram sent by the bishop and his clergy, that afternoon, the governor of Mosul commanded a colonel to march his regiment to Zacho within 24 hours. They arrived at sunrise the next morning, making the town a garrison point. The poem goes on to remark that for a period of 43 days, between the 3rd of July and 15th of August, the Assyrians of the Cizre district had come under attack. The Assyrians, who had been invited to death, Mkurm al-Mota, spent these days in sorrow and fear like their biblical Ninevite ancestors, praying, fasting, and doing penance with all their hearts. Significantly, they are also noted as having paid off some Muslims in exchange for saving their own lives. The poem then goes on to describe the systematic genocidal process which had taken place. Notables, headmen, priests, deacons, and bishops were arrested, dragged through the marketplaces, and imprisoned. From these prisons, they were deported in convoys and murdered in secluded valleys. After the men had been killed, they turned on the women and children, who were ripped apart with daggers. Among the prelates who lost their lives was Philip Jacob Abraham, the Chaldean Catholic Bishop of Cizre, who was bound and murdered. Bishops and priests were thus killed and thrown onto dung heaps. According to the poem, in the region of Cizre and Sirt, 4 bishops, 1 and 3, and 34 priests, 16 and 12 and 6, were killed. Additionally, Yusuf Said, the leader of Cizre's Christians, was humiliatingly murdered. The poem then turns to reporting a convoy of Armenian deportees which had passed through Zacho, and which the author himself had witnessed. According to telegraphs, 12,000 Armenian civilians had been deported from Erzurum. The men were killed on the way, while the women and young girls were raped and forced to convert to Islam. The little children were sold or auctioned off in villages along the way. Roughly 1,000 of them reached Zacho, where many of them died of hunger, thirst, cold, and fear, and 2 or 3 buried together at a time. Some died and were not buried, but were thrown into a ditch, where their corpses were eaten by dogs. Some wished to remain in Zacho, where they gave themselves up to Muslim families, presumably as slaves, and the rest were sent to Mosul and the surrounding area. The author then states that hundreds to thousands and millions of Armenians and an undetermined number of thousands of Chaldeans, Syriac Catholics, and Jacobites, Syriac Orthodox, lost their lives during this period. He compared the killing to that which had occurred under the Persian kings during the Sasanian period, noting that this, however, was more severe. Those martyrs had been killed for not worshipping fire or the sun as their overlords had demanded, but little children were spared. He thus blamed the murder and dispersal of children during his own time on the Ottoman government. The shared narrative in the 2 reductions of the poem ends with the image of a mother killed and lying face down with her daughter at her breast, soaked in her blood, crying out for her and dying of thirst, hunger, and heat exhaustion. So let me turn a little bit to the historical context. 5 minutes? No! Let's see. So most of the events described in the poem, except for the attack on Bedaro and threat on Zacho, are corroborated in a number of other sources. For instance, we know that Suleiman, Ismail, and the Aghas of Shirnakh and Silopi attacked Gerekted Badro, Tel Qabbin, and Wasta, where the villagers were slaughtered like sheep. as well as Taqiyan, where the inhabitants tried to defend themselves in the village's large monastery church. These were then locked inside the church and it was set on fire. Moreover, the large village of Peshawar comprised the region's largest rural Chaldean Catholic congregation and was the center of an Ottoman administrative sub-district or Nahiyeh. It was attacked by the sons of Muhammad Mistoagha of the Kurdish Artoshi tribe, as well as the Kurdish Miran tribe, who are believed to have massacred at least 900 of its inhabitants in one day. This was reported 4 days after the fact, on the 15th of July 1915, by German consul in Mosul, Walter Holstein, who stated that the entire population, consisting exclusively of Chaldean Christian population, was massacred. As for Mansouriya, it was attacked by the Chokhsora Kurdish tribe, and many of the village's women threw themselves into the Tigris River to avoid falling into their hands, while others were taken away and enslaved. Interestingly, this village is omitted from most recensions of the poem and is only included in the one copied by Isha Gharib. This is probably because it was not part of the original text and was only inserted later by descendants of survivors from this village who became refugees in Zaho and thus joined the local Chaldean Catholic diocese. The reason for this omission may be the fact that the Chaldean Catholics there accounted for only 80 souls without a church or priest. On the other hand, the majority of the village's Assyrian inhabitants were Presbyterian evangelicals or adherents of the Church of the East. The same was the case in other villages not mentioned in the poem. Shach, for instance, which was also the center of a Nahiyeh, had 300 Assyrian inhabitants, of which 140 were Chaldean Catholics, so a minority, but they had a church and a priest. These were massacred by Turkish soldiers who had been stationed there by the Ottoman government, and among the victims were the Presbyterian pastors Elia and Sergius, while the women and children who survived were reduced to a state of captivity. Hassana, on the other hand, had no Chaldean Catholics, and its 300 to 420 inhabitants belonged mostly to the Church of the East and Presbyterian Evangelical Church. These were also massacred by the Aghas of Shernach and Silopi, whose tenants they had been. The Presbyterian pastor Matei, was killed by Kurds in the mountain while fleeing, and the Church of the East priest was also murdered, while some of the survivors found refuge in the nearby Kurdish village of Garchulaye. So it is quite clear from the poem that Yonan, son of Abraham, as a Chaldean Catholic priest, was intimately acquainted with his co-religionists only in the villages that he described, as well as their headmen and priests. The fact that he was a Chaldean Catholic would additionally explain why a number of Assyrians in the same village, in the same district, who were also attacked, were clearly omitted from his account of the massacres. He additionally omits the small village of Nahrawan, which had 120 Chaldean Catholic inhabitants with a chapel and no priest, as well as 80 who had remained adherents of the Church of the East. Similarly omitted is the now Chaldean Catholic village of Bespin, which had 200 Assyrian inhabitants and does not show up in Chaldean Catholic statistics from 1913, probably because they still belonged to the Church of the East at the time. Now, both of these villages were attacked and destroyed by Botan Kurds. French Dominican priest Hyacinth Simon noted massacres in 15 Chaldean Catholic villages near Cizre, where 15,000 were killed. A total of 35 Assyrian villages in the district of Cizre of all denominations were exterminated during this period at the chief instigation of Diyarbakar's bloodthirsty governor Rashid Bey, despite the strong resistance put up by the Kaymakam and some prominent Muslims. Now, American Presbyterian missionary Reverend Edmund Wilson McDowell noted a general massacre, as well as that the Kurds and Turkish soldiers had put the Christians of all those villages, as well as Cizre, to the sword by order of the government. While the lives of some Assyrians had been saved through the influence of Kurdish Aghas, they were unable to protect them for long, as the government would not permit it and threatened such friendly Kurds with punishment if they did not obey orders and complete the work. Since the poem does not describe the massacres in the town of Cizre, which took place between the 20th of August and the 1st of September, in any detail, and owing to time constraints, I'll refrain from going into any detail regarding them here. And we'll save that only say that I will save that for the published version of the paper. Suffice it to say that the Chaldean Catholic bishop was arrested by soldiers and imprisoned on August 27th. The following evening he was called to court and interrogated on whatever weapons he and his congregation possessed. The bishop laughed it off, assuring his accusers that neither he nor his congregation had anything of the sort. Those present became extremely wild and took turns beating him. He was then shot to death, and his corpse was carried out of town, stripped, and left by the Tigris River. A small number of survivors from Cizre took refuge in Mosul, but they were devastated by famine in 1917. Hyacinth Simon further mentioned the massacre of 200 males from Erzurum, presumably Armenian, during a military inspection by Khalil Pasha on the 22nd of September 1915 at a place 3 hours southeast of Cizre, but it is unknown whether or not this is related to the convoy mentioned in the poem. Now, I'm coming to my conclusions. Okay, so the poem on the massacres in the district of Cizre and Navroy by the priest Yonan only provides details regarding the 5 largest Chaldean Catholic villages and neglects those with smaller Chaldean Catholic communities or Assyrians of other Christian denominations. Nevertheless, it remains an important account of the atrocities committed, since it details the extermination of between 2,430 and 3,230 people in these 5 villages alone, accounting for 70 to 73% of their previous combinations combined. When one additionally considers the fact that these villages prior to the genocide comprised roughly 59% of the population of Cizre's Chaldean Catholic diocese, these particular deaths constitute a loss of between 41 and 43% of the diocese's population as a whole. Again, this is without considering the amount of lives lost in the town itself, as well as the other 12 or more Chaldean Catholic villages that depended on it. It additionally provides an insight into the amount of Assyrian lives lost elsewhere in the region and other places, as well as the systematic genocidal process implemented by the perpetrators. I was going to say a little bit about the bishops that were killed, that are mentioned. It's interesting to note how many, what percentage of priests were killed from the dioceses. I've got that in your handout, so I don't need to mention that. I just want to say that the poem is a valuable and unique, if only partial, contemporary genocide account, and it is something that needs to be studied in further detail, and hopefully we will find more texts like this that we can study, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nicholas. Now the floor is with you. So if you have any comments or questions. We have roughly 7 minutes. First Jan, then Abu.
Fascinating is not the right word for it, but thanks for the contribution. The one thing that you said, that one person that is copying at least 3 times the same poem, it was in the 90s, so he or his family should still be around. Have you been able to do any research regarding that person, why he did this type of copying and preserving this poem?
So he was from the village of Asnach, which is also known as Sanat. And Asnach is the northernmost village on the Zafo side, is the northernmost Christian village and is quite close to the Turkish border. It could be that his family came to Asnach from Turkey, but I'm not sure. I do plan on consulting with His Grace Bishop Najib Mikhail, Archbishop of Mosul, Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Mosul, because one, he's a Dominican father, so he was a Dominican father before becoming bishop, so his monastery had these 2 copies of this manuscript, of this text, and also he is from Asnach, so he would probably not have known this copyist personally. He might even be related to him. So when I go back to Iraq, I plan on delving deeper into who this Mattei, son of Isa, was.
Melfono, Niklas, I wonder if the details you mentioned here were otherwise written about from Western missionaries or Western diplomats, or is it the only source what you presented?
So for these particular 5 Chaldean Catholic villages, the main source is the poem. There is a letter from a Presbyterian missionary, Reverend McDowell, but he writes about the Protestant villages. So he writes about Mansouriya, Shah, Hassan. He doesn't write about the Catholic villages. Unfortunately, a lot of the sources are skewed towards religious affiliation, and so people tend to write only about their own people from their own denomination. Peshawar, as I said, was mentioned by German Consul Walter Holstein, and some of these events are also described by Israel Odo in his account, and very minimally by Joseph Naim. He only talks about the city of Cizre, though. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicola. You said it actually already. This is our problem with this text and comparable texts. We have Mansour, Shah and Hassan who are Protestant by majority,
yes,
by overwhelming majority, and they are almost not mentioned. And in Cizre you had a big Syrian Orthodox community with a bishop. It is not mentioned at all. So unfortunately we have always who said it one wing, one side of the medal, but we don't know the rest. The Syrian Orthodox of Cizre, many of them who could escape, they went to Azakh.
Yes.
Yeah? So yes, but thank you very much for this poem, which is very important actually, even which I received in the 90s from John. Yes, thank you to him.
Saudi.
And now, just in relation to your question here, there is also Jacques Pétoré who mentions in his own book, I'll talk about it now a bit later on. So, yeah, they are testimonies that we have to collect, and I hope that Nicholas will have time to make a wider research up in the whole drastic and dramatic situation that our people have suffered during that period. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The report by Abuna Teber, who worked and lived here in Berlin. His work was first in Azef, and he went across the Tigris River and writes a little bit about the villages just east of Cizre and the Kurdish situation too.
So at the end, it was very quick with the numbers. I mean, when you talk about Cizre, it's about 2,803 up to 3,200 people, and about 74% of them. Does it mean 74% now were killed out of the population, or 34% of the population was Chaldeans? And can you explain the number a little bit more clear, and who were the others?
Okay, thank you for the question. I had to rush through that part of the talk. So, the population of those five particular villages that are mentioned in the poem. So, 71 to 73% of the population of these 5 Chaldean Catholic villages was killed, roughly. If you look at the handout, you'll see sort of the rough population from the different statistics, and then what Yonan Abraham says. He says either the majority of them were killed, or half of them were killed, or 100 survived, or 30 were killed. When you add those numbers up in a sort of, approximate manner, then you come to the conclusion that out of the combination of the population of those 5 Chaldean Catholic villages, roughly 71 to 73% were exterminated.
And the villages, was it just Chaldean? I mean,
these 5 villages were just...
other populations?
No. I mean, some of these villages are mentioned, for example, in the 1877 list of the Lemme of priest Abdullah Sattuf, who later became Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Ignatius Abdullah Sattuf. He went to the area and he mentioned some people's names and collected some money from them for the Syriac Orthodox Church, but I think they were actually all Chaldean Catholic at the time.
Great. Thank you, Nicholas, for
Thank
this
you.
fascinating presentation. Our second speaker is Efrem Yildiz from University of Salamanca, and he is going to talk about the written and oral sources from the Botan region on the Assyrian genocide. Please welcome.
Okay, good morning, and first of all, before starting with my short communication, I would love to express my gratitude to the University of Freie Berlin, and especially to Professor Shabat for this invitation. And yeah, this is a golden occasion to talk about those topics that are not usually dealt in a systematic way. Probably we have also to deal it with in a coordinated way, because Nicholas and we should have talked about what are you going to talk about in order to avoid repeating, because I'm dealing exactly with the same things, but from a different perspective. So I will be complementary to what Dr. Al-Jeloo has still underlined and expressed in a very and excellent way. Yes, as you can see, the written and oral sources on Assyrian genocide in Botan region. So, it's usually very common that the people, especially among the Assyrian communities, when they talk about Assyrians, they think about Tur ad-Din, Hakkari, and then you go directly to Mosul and so on. And very, very few times is Botan mentioned as part of the Assyrian region and Assyrian inhabitants. This is why I decided to talk. I will also underline some hard paragraphs of the testimonies that have been expressed to those who recorded, the eyewitnesses' testimonies of that time. So I'm going to start when I just give me a sign, as I have been yesterday quite rude in respected time. I'll do my best to do so. So much has been written and uncovered regarding the Assyrian genocide, yet full understanding continues to elude us. As you have seen, we need much more data. New revelations persistently surfaced, exposing the varied cruelty that swept through northern Mesopotamia, particularly in the regions of Botan, Diyarbakir, Mardin, Sert, Urfa, Hakkari. Among this, the Botan region, as I was underlying, remains relatively obscure. Numerous villages within its boundaries remain unmentioned and forgotten, not only by the broader world, but tragically even among the Assyrian people themselves. The widespread historical amnesia is somehow due to the fact that we are divided according to the different ecclesiastical branches, and each of us, or each of them, they mention their own victims. And this is the truth. Given the constraint of time, I will focus on the intervention, especially on the tragic fate of Gazarta that has been mentioned by Dr. Al-Jeloo, especially from 1914 until 1918. And what I'm going to tell you is not my research. I have based what I'm going to tell you upon what was recorded by several people from different villages. Especially, I have focused on the eyewitnesses that were recorded by Isho Yabash. I would love to put you in contact with him, because he has huge material, okay, from our elders. But at the same time, also, Qasheleus Bar Khamiso, who is called Karatai, also he has somehow recorded when he was in Mer and in the region as priest. He started recording also many data. What happened with those villages that are never mentioned in the books on behalf of the Western writers and so on. But let's go just a bit, because as I told you, this is now Botan region. As you can see where it is located, it's in the south of Turkey. And when we talk about Botan, we never mention what happened yesterday or during these 2 days. Several times Botan was mentioned in relation to Badr Khanbeg. And in reality, we should talk about first and second genocide, because the first genocide was somehow undertaken during the Badr Khanbeg massacres. Tens of thousands of people suffered from 1843, 1846, the massacre, and they are not well really recorded in the annals. So this should be also mentioned, and probably a deep study should be done in relation to the first genocide and then going on to the second one. As far as the second genocide period is concerned, the sources related to Gazarta, where Dr. Al-Jeloo has still spoken, report that our Assyrian brothers and sisters in the area were different Christian groups: Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholics, Chaldeans, and so on. What for me in the report, I'm going to talk also about the report of Jacques Retore, who was at that time in the region, and he collected many testimonies, okay? And what Jacques Retore in his book, which was edited in French, Les Chrétiens au Bêtes, he clearly underlines that many villages inhabited by many members of the Syriac Orthodox Church and other 15 villages that were populated by the members of the Chaldean Church were totally destroyed. Let's go to this is what I'm going to talk about. So, according to the report of Israel Auda that has been mentioned previously by Dr. Al-Jeloo, in the middle of September, the head of Mardin city sent his brother Silo to the hills of Gazarta, inquiring as to why they had still not started killing the Christians that were living among and around them. As we did, he cites, as we did and as our brothers have everywhere. You have to start immediately and without hesitation and being late. Now is the time of vengeance against our adversaries, and the time to exterminate the enemies of our religion and erase them from our region and land. So imagine what happened when the Muslims received such a message. We usually in the records, always the priests, the bishops are recorded. Dr. Al-Jeloo has still mentioned. So the first victims, as you can see, were Bishop Yaqub Auraham and the Chaldean Church of the Chaldean Church, Mar Michael Melke of the Syriac Catholic Church, was in the priests of both churches, Hanna Marcos Elia of the Chaldean Church, Simon and Paulus of the Syriac Catholic Church, were all taken to prison and afterwards killed in a dreadful circumstance. Israel Auda's report provides us with the terrible details of how they murdered the clergy. First, both bishops were bound by their feet. If I might have put it here. Were bound by their feet and were dragged around the city center like animal carcass, and then they were driven next to the Tigris riverbank, where their naked bodies were abandoned to become food for dogs, jackals, and ravens. Afterwards, it was the turn of the priests who suffered unimaginable atrocities before they gave up their last breath. The persecutors came back, took the priests, and submitted them to horrible tortures and outrages.
spitting on their face, snatching their beards, and kicking their belly as if they were beating an animal. They broke their bones and their heads were crushed. Afterwards, they were driven out and mocked in their nakedness as they were animals. So imagine how this is what Israel Aulos directly relates. As I told you, this is Jacques Retores also, what he is also reporting in that sense. Dr. Al-Jeloo has mentioned those villages that were totally, let's say, at least say I will mention Mansouriya, Peshawar, who really suffered in a drastic way the genocide. Now, it's not only Peshawar and Mansouriya, but also Mar Yaqub's village, and where there was a Dominican residence, and that was some kind of dream of the Kurdish chieftain of the Artoshi Kurds, who was willing to have it as his own residence. So when they killed then almost all the people, but as this part was under the Duhok, let's say, district Kaimakam, then they killed, they plundered everything, and then they went back. But when the Turkish soldiers came back, it was too late. But at the end, this was for the first time that the Haydar Bey, he punished the Kurdish chieftain for that atrocity as well. I'm going to focus, as I have a few minutes, to focus on what really happened with the several villages that are even, I thought that Nicholas was going to mention many other villages that are never mentioned, but this is a time where I can just, in order to mention, Harbole, Bespin was mentioned, Wasta, Al-Qabban, Taqiyya, Naurwan, Girge Bedro, Dadar, Hassan, Mansouriye, Deran, Khata, Deran, Allata, Jannat, Dargule, district of Shurnaq, also Bejan, Bulun, Marga, Okwal, Ishi, Baznai, Haltun, Hos, Mer, Gaznach, and so on. In a way or other, they have suffered the genocide effects. Okay? Indeed, when during the period when Sumbash in the case, I'm Harbolaya, okay? This is why I was expecting that Dr. Al-Jeloo would mention Harboli because he loves me, but he didn't do it. So anyway, yeah, even 12 people from Harboli were killed at that time, okay? Why the rest was not killed? They fled to the mountains. They tried to find some protection by the Kurdish tribes, but they were rejected. So the unique possibility was to fly to the mountains and wait until, let's say, the genocide effects were going to be reduced somehow. Most of the inhabitants, as has been underlined previously, of Wasta, Talqab, Taqiyya, Naur, and Girge Bedro, and Mansouriya were killed, and the villages were totally destroyed and emptied. Bespin, Gürümlüköy. Also, there is a case that the Bespinai were protected by their own Kurdish Akhas. And there was a tactic. Now, for instance, they proposed them to tell to the persecutors that they were converted to Islam, and they were given the chance to continue being Muslims or to go back to their Christian religion. So this is why the Bespinai were really saved. And then, of course, Mer. In Mer, the genocide didn't took place as in other places because they were protected by the Kurdish lords or chieftains. But anyway, there were some 2 or 3 were killed, and this is reported by Qasha Lewis Barkhamiso's report and what happened in Mer. The Mariae looked for, let's say, for protection on behalf of Der Hinai. This is the Kurdish tribe that was at that time, let's say, somehow they were a kind of lords of the region, and they looked for protection through them. But at least there were some people killed, like the deacon Matte, or Khawsho, son of Mar'aha, were assassinated at that time. Why this last one is not counted among those who were killed? Because he was killed in another place. So the testimony doesn't reflect that he was killed in Mer itself. Also, Hus, as you can see, where is the point? In Hus, the many thing happened was they were obliged to abandon, and they immediately looked protection under the Russian control. So they fled to Van. But when the Bolshevik, I'm going to finish. When the Bolshevik, revolution raised, then they were obliged to also abandon again, and they ended up in Habaniya and Baquba. Hassana was mentioned. According to the report I have by Isho Bar Hasnaya, at least 25 people were killed. Okay? And why? Because when Hasnaya tried to look for protection on behalf of the Kurdish chieftain who were Khaye Sor, they didn't give him any protection. They were telling them that they were with the Turkish forces, and that, wait, I beg your pardon, I'll come to that afterwards. So this is why also those who couldn't move from Hassana Isaf were killed. Anyway, I could mention many other villages, but now I would love to also. Geznach has they had a kind of protection on the Kurdish side, but at least there were three brothers, Ablahat, Shleiman, and Yosef, were also assassinated at that time. And we mention always genocide, but we don't focus on the first, second, and even third, according to my opinion. In 1926, many villages were totally destroyed. And it's almost forgotten by many historians. Hertevin, as you know, it happened the same to them. They were obliged to fly to Mersin, and then from Mersin to the western countries. I'm going to talk about a kind of testimonies of two cruel actions that show how the human being can become really a beast when they don't use the head and the heart. Okay? And this testimony is given from our sources, that when hate is there, even a baby is not counted as a human being, but as an enemy. And this is what happened to in this case to a Hertevnata, and I'm going to read it because I'm unable to explain it. What is incredibly hard to assimilate is the cruel manner by which they enjoyed hurting the defenseless children, like the case of the daughter-in-law of the local priest of the Assyrian village, Hertevin, who was murdered together with her son. They let the woman who had her baby with her. As usual, it was as it was a woman, the Muslim first tried to convert her and add her to their harem. First, they tried to convince her to become Muslim and abandon her baby. But she rejected the offer twice. They then imitated her with their guns, but she still refused to renounce her faith, and after several beatings was brutally killed. After they left, her baby of less than a year remained at her side for 2 weeks. Once their thirst of Christian blood was satisfied, they decided to return to their villages. When they arrived at the place where they killed this woman, they realized that her body was incorrupted and her baby was nourishing himself from his mother's breast. Yes. The man, not receiving enough satisfaction from killing the child's mother, took the baby and threw him in the water canal that was transporting water to the water mill. On arriving to the mill, they enjoyed seeing a baby less than 1 year old fighting for his life, and he refused to drown. One of them said, "This son of infidels will not die without my stick." So he took his stick and beat the baby to death. This atrocity was carried out simply because the victim was a Christian. Similar atrocities have been spoken by Kuvi, the son of Janjir, who lived in Silopi. As Kuvi had some friends from the village of Herbole, so it's a recent story that was told, his father Ginger told them about the atrocity he undertook with 3 Assyrian babies that were left in the village of Girgebedro that you mentioned, dear Nicholas, which was previously inhabited by the Christians, but once it was emptied by the Kurds, they settled there. He once confessed that he had much grief each time he remembers how they killed 3 defenseless babies that were not yet dead. He recalls, "We were going back to Girgebedro to look for objects that the Christians hide in their homes. We came upon 3 small babies in their cradles. We took the babies out of the village and we saw an anthill, and we bound them and put them next to the anthill. Afterwards, we left to plunder other Christian villages. On the way back home, we wanted to see what happened with those 3 babies whose feet and hands we bound in order to avoid them moving. When we arrived, we saw a horrible image. The babies were killed by ants which had even entered their bodies even through their eyes and other orifices, as they were exposed to the merciless summer sun." What was the crime these 3 babies had committed, is the question. Only their tender Christian faith. But Ginger recognized that this atrocity will remain with him until his death because of the way these 3 babies were bitterly murdered. I'm finishing. Killing defenseless children in this way can only be qualified as a sign of being a beast. No human being is able to do such an atrocity. So you can imagine what kind of circumstances, what kind of horrible slaughterings, massacres have been taking place in that region. Today we are talking from far. I was translating this text, which is in Israel Aldo's book, and I stopped translating the book. I couldn't go. It was impossible to continue with the translation. Seeing 3 babies dying in this way, it was for me impossible to continue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We have roughly 5 to 6 minutes. We can take 3 to 4 questions or comments. Anyone who wishes to just pose a question?
I think from this region we have also many survivors, and what happened to them was that they were almost slaves of their Aras later.
Exactly.
And they call it, during my recordings, they call it always as Holamut al-Muslim. Mutter, this is the slavery of Egypt,
Yeah.
comparing the Old Testamental situation. Yes, we lack information about this region. I did in the 90s for Oteaso some recordings, but they are not really studied yet. So these are just testimonies, oral history, and the written text should be checked as well, compared to the oral history. I don't know of anybody actually doing research in this yet, and my recordings are also waiting, and I try to have two people doing research on these dialects, especially on these dialects, recording materials, but both of them, one of them got crazy and the other was crazy. I don't know what happened, at least we lost all the material. I tried to get them, but it's almost impossible.
Yes, this is the biggest problem we are facing now. In order to have a clear map, vision upon what happened to this region, I think this is the region that less has been studied in the last 2 centuries, honestly. So this is why probably the Nineveh academic chair that has been founded at the University of Salamanca is going to focus on those working groups to collect all those materials that need a kind of studies, that need a kind of work, and hopefully Dr. Al-Jeloo will continue with this kind of works that are absolutely needed. The modern history of Syrian fellows needs an update in many senses, and one of them is this. So hopefully we'll have the chance to even finance, if we have the financial support, also such research works, yeah.
I can take 1 or 2 more questions or comments. Does anyone want to? It seems like, okay, yeah.
I saw in one of the slides Bishop Michael
Melke, yeah.
Melke, I think he was born from Catholic, Syriac Orthodox family, but he became Bishop of the Syriac Catholic. He was not Bishop of Syriac Orthodox. I saw you mention him as Syriac Orthodox.
Oh, I put, yeah.
Yeah, he's Syriac Catholic Bishop.
Thank you for the correction, yeah. But in the report he is considered. In the report, what I did was translating, especially from Jacques Hattor's text, that he is considered as such. So this is why I respected it. But thank you. Yeah. What I'm telling you is not based on my, but it was on the sources that I have been consulting. Yeah.
Great. A few last remarks from my side. Like 13 years ago, I guess, so then we gathered in the Netherlands for a conference, for a workshop about SAFO. We concluded that I think we need more area studies. We need to unpack SAFO. It's not like one big whole narrative that should be unpacked. We need to speed up, I guess, so just after 13 years we see that we could have done more, so that's like a self-criticism to ourselves. We still have, we are struggling with fragmented sources. But one thing is important, which is important, is to develop a framework to study all these particular areas, not like from different perspectives. That's the diversity, that's richness, but a framework to identify who are the actors involved, networks, state, non-state actors, local actors, mechanisms, pre and post-SAFO, post-SAFO period. These are things I think we need to identify, just explore and map them. That will give a very big input for the SAFO studies, I think. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Efrem Yildiz. So, our next speaker in our session is Professor Tessa Hofmann from FE Berlin, SAFO 1915, Interdisciplinary Approach to the Genocide of Assyrians and Armenians. Yeah. Please.
It's just the image.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues,
First of all, let me thank the organizers for this very important conference. And I would like to share some thoughts with you about the aftermath of the genocidal destructions and the interdisciplinary approaches to the genocide of Syriacs. In his groundbreaking monograph, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe of 1954, Raphael Lemkin, who 4 years later became the main author of the UN Genocide Convention, provided a remarkable definition of genocide as a group-related offense, quotation. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, and the actions involved are directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group, end of quotation. This leads to the conclusion that individual members of a targeted group may escape death, but are prevented from continuing to live as members of the destroyed group. The survivors of the Ottoman genocide of up to 3.5 million Christians provide a vivid example of this. If we take the genocide against the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire as a benchmark, several similarities and differences can be seen in the extermination of the Syriac population of the Ottoman Empire and that of northwestern Iran. The differences arise primarily from the smaller size and the geographical dispersion of the Syriacs and Assyrians. Two different basic situations can be observed. While Syriacs were deliberately attacked, expelled, or destroyed in the east of the Ottoman Empire, especially in the Vilayet Van, and in northwestern Iran during the Ottoman occupation of the latter, they became victims in the southwest of the Ottoman Empire during and alongside the extermination of the Armenians. What happened to the survivors of the genocide who remained in the Ottoman Empire or later in the Republic of Turkey? In the absence of empirical studies on Syriacs, I have again to relate to the example of Armenian population. Islamization or Alevitization, especially in the Dersim region, linguistic assimilation, forced self-denial due to the circumstances, and experience of multiple genocide and deportations in the Sassoon and Dersim regions characterize the situation of at least two post-genocidal generations. In addition, there are the interactions with the Kurdish tribal system, which offered protection from physical annihilation on condition of submission and enslavement as maraba, serfdom. It was only in the 1990s that a renaissance of national consciousness occurred among Islamized Pontus Greeks and even 10 years later among people of Armenian descent in Dersim. In some cases, this was accompanied by a reconversion to Christianity, especially among those who had resettled in Istanbul. This phenomenon raises the question of the significance of religious affiliation for the for the respective collective and individual identity. As Alevi Armenians from Dersim emphasize, one can change his religion, but not the ethnicity. In the absence of empirical studies and surveys, I must rely on interviews conducted by Armenian author Avetis Hajian around the year 2014 with residents of Turkey of Armenian descent, and in particular on the 72 interviews conducted by Kurdish Alevi film director Kazim Gündoğan from Dersim. He interviewed Alevi and Alevized Armenians from Dersim of different generations. In areas such as Dersim that eluded the control of the central state authority, regional specifics play a significant role. In the central Anatolian region Dersim, these included above all tribal structures. Alevism is likewise not based on an egalitarian system, but on a caste system of rank and file believers and their spiritual leaders called pirs or dede or rebers. Probably under the influence of the Kurdish tribal system, Armenian society in Dersim also saw the formation of clans and tribes. Clans and tribes, which was otherwise unusual for Armenians. In his travelogue Dersim, published in Tiflis in 1900, the Armenian author Andranik Yeretsian reported on the Armenian tribe of the Mirakian, who lived in harmony with the Alevis of central or mountainous Dersim. Yeretsian gives the number of Mirakian tribesmen as 8,000. They spoke a special dialect and are considered descendants of the Mamikonyan noble family. This family famous in Armenian history. Together with the Kizilbash, they were traditionally considered the guardians of the Halvor sanctuary. The Mirakian tribe had 3,000 men under arms when they took part in the Dersimis battles against the Ottoman army. When Reshid Pasha advanced with a force of 40,000 in 1834, the Mirakians played an important role in defending Dersim. But not all the inhabitants of Dersim were tribesmen or ashiretler, neither among the Christian Armenians nor among the Muslim or Alevi Kurds and Zazas. Many farmers, by no means only Armenians but also the Kurdish villagers, lived as subordinates, as maraba of their landlords, in a personal relationship of dependency that in many aspects came close to serfdom, but at the same time also placed them under the protection of their base, tribal leaders or urban notables. The base position of power was based on the institution of tax farming. In some cases, they controlled not only individual villages but entire regions. The ambivalent character of the Dersim tribal system is clearly expressed in the interviews conducted by Kazim Gündoğan with Alevized descendants of Armenian genocide survivors. The Dersim Armenians and those who fled to Dersim in 1915 submitted to the local landlords at the expense of their social, economic, and cultural bondage or affiliation, the expense of Alevization or Islamization with simultaneous linguistic assimilation and services or taxes for their protectors, who, among other things, merit them at their own discretion. The protection granted to those threatened with death was, as their descendants very clearly recognized, not out of affection, but out of self-interest, because Armenians were prized craftsmen and farmers not only in Dersim. Ida or Ayten Güneş, born in 1960, for example, states in her interview about her grandfather, quotation, "Of course, the Ara, or landowner, did not release him, but married him off and had him and his wife work for him as slaves. They took Armenian children under their protection, protected them, adopted them, but at the same time they used them as serfs. That too is a fact. Indeed, they often adopted the children of wealthy families at that time because the more children of wealthy families you take in, the more prosperous you will be in the future." Musa Tehani, born in 1954, mentions in his interview that sexual assault of Armenian women was part of this serfdom system, quotation. "First, they expelled the Armenians and enslaved the rest of us. They kept us as marabas, as slaves, who took care of their horses, stables, and work. Not because they liked us, but because they needed laborers. It is bitter to say this, but when the Aras wanted, they took the family and the wives of the marabas, used them, then returned them or left them. So the Armenians had nothing." End of quotation. And Şengül Gündoğdu definitely explained, quotation, "My late father used to say, sadly, we have become serfs on our own land, because this land once belonged to the Armenians. They took the land that belonged to them. They bought the fields of the Armenians, that is, the land of their ancestors. There were many land struggles. In these matters, the state was on the side of the Alevis. It was not in a position to support an Armenian." End of quotation. Countervailing tendencies only emerged when the pro-communist and revolutionary movements of the 1970s, when young people in Dersim in particular recognized and condemned the tribal system as backward and repressive. The 1980 coup d'etat ended this development through the political persecution of the revolutionaries. Which path did the Syriacs take during and after the Seifo? I suspect that tribalism was even more pronounced among the Syriac people than among the Armenians, who were urbanized to a higher degree. It can further be assumed that by 1915, at the latest, Syriacs also sought refuge with Kurdish tribes. We just heard examples of this. What were the consequences of this? Presumably religious and linguistic assimilation. Were there later reconversions, and if so, under which conditions? Through relocation to large cities, namely Istanbul, through out-migration to Europe, America, and Australia. The statements of Armenians from Dersim interviewed by Kazım Gündoğan indicate that both in 1915 and 1938, the tribal leaders of the Kurds and Zazas were asked whether the Armenians earmarked for deportation belonged to their tribes. That is, whether they were under the protection of certain tribal leaders. These Aras thus had the final say on the fate of Alevis or Christians of Armenian origin. The situation appears to have been similar for Syriac Christians in northern Mesopotamia. Research into the post-genocidal situation of Christian genocide survivors in Turkey and in the European and transatlantic diaspora seems to me to be an important but hitherto largely neglected topic in comparative genocide studies. This would confirm that what is already suspected, the SEFO did not end with World War I. The qualitative and quantitative role played by serfdom in the tribal system of the Kurds and the Syriac people should ideally be investigated through interdisciplinary research projects combining Syriac and Kurdish studies, sociology, and oral history. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the final presentation. Yeah. Questions or comments from the audience?
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hofmann. It is very helpful to compare what we work on with the situation in different regions and ethnicities. So this sharpens our minds and eyes and so on. Now, what I'm going to say is a kind of follow-up of the last meeting we had here a few weeks ago. The word of tribalism and urbanism, maybe. I don't know anything about their scene, but I'm not sure how to describe the difference between the villages and the situation in the city of Diyarbakir in 1915, because there were also families, or maybe you should call them clans. They tried to get villages under their control from the city. So they live in the city, but they have their big families everywhere around too. So I think there still needs much work to be done on this. In the sources I didn't find anything about these things in the cities, except in Mardin, but for the year 1895. The Kurdish clans who protect the Christian population, so there's also kind of family system in the city. But I don't know much about this, but I think the work must be done.
Yes, I agree. There are many indications that Syriacs fell under the system of tribalism, which was combined with serfdom, with enslavement. And this continued far into the 20th century. I remember that in the early 1980s, der Pressedienst der evangelischen Kirche wrote or reported about this. That was the time when mass immigration from the Tur Abdin region had started, and many asylum seekers and de facto refugees from that area, Syriacs, arrived in Central and North Europe. So the real reason was exactly that, continuing serfdom, threat, unsafety in the villages concerned. And of course the situation worsened with the outmigration. The less the Syriac population was, the more they were threatened and endangered. It was a time when girls were abducted, Christian girls, because Kurds, mainly the perpetrators were Kurds, wanted to save the dowry, otherwise to be paid to a Muslim girl and her family. So, but there are no systematic studies so far, empirical studies. And what I wanted to forward to you is an impulse to not only to look at the years of the First World War, the years 1915 and 1917, but to look into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and so far. What happened in the interactions between Kurdish tribes? I'm not speaking about Kurds who were not related to tribes, Kurdish tribes, and the Christian population, the survivors of the Cizre.
Thank you very much, Frau Hofmann. We have, regarding the Botan region, actually exactly the same. Many of the survivors, they survived only because they were protected by their Aras, they call them Arayan, our Aras, and many of them converted to Islam. In the end of the 60s and 70s, they are called Muslimani, not Muslim normal term, so Muslimani is somehow a diminutive. Yeah, in that region, in the north of Tigris River between Diyarbakir and Licia, they call them Bafala in Kurdish. But in this region of Botan, they call them Muslimani, and but many of them converted back to Christianity, partly with the support of the current Aras, then current Aras of the 70s, 80s, especially the priest mentioned, Teber, before somebody mentioned the priest Johann Teber, who was here in Berlin. He was sent by the bishop to these regions, and he baptized and ordained and whatever, everything he did to bring them back with the support, partly with the support of the Aras. Yeah? So we know from other places where Bishop Cizre or his father was going to the Deshiri and Razan regions to accept those who wanted to come back to the Syriac Orthodox faith and converted back to Christianity. Some, of course, a few of them. And of course, we don't have a research about this at all. So it's just oral history, oral sayings, and we have some recordings, but not real research is done on this issue. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. For me, what is important is to understand the ambivalent meaning of the word protection. Because, yes, physically, these people were protected. Armenian Syriacs, they were taken in by Kurdish tribes. But at which price? And for that reason, in the beginning, I quoted Raphael Lemkin. You may physically survive a genocide, but not as a member of the persecuted group. So, to look more deeper into the matter, one has to study which assimilation processes were going on in the regions or villages concerned. Did the so-called protected people have to change their religion? Did they get Islamized? And if Syriacs were Islamized, what was the continuation? Were there reconversions observed? Were they linguistically Kurdicized and had to give up their own language? What happened? In which way? To which degree? This is really something for the next years to empirically study.
Dr. Hofmann, thank you first. You have been engaged in genocide research from the very beginning here in Germany.
Yeah.
And as you know, initially 1915-18 events were only Armenian issue, Armenian genocide. So slowly then in the 90s, let me say then after 2000, the Assyrian genocide emerged in the research, at least internationally, with Gabriele Yonan and publication, and also David Gaunt, so then made it into international arena. And after that, the Pontus Greek research came up. And now, when we look at the recent publications coming out, there are all three paths are emerging. So scholars are talking now on a Christian genocide from 1914 to 1924. So 30 years of genocide. So do you think that that's now the genocide research is where it should have been from the very beginning? How do you see that?
Of course, over such a long period, there are always developments to be observed. In Germany, the research of the Assyrian genocide started, to my knowledge, even before the genocide of the Armenians. If you look at the Society for Threatened Peoples, Gabriele Jonan's monograph on the topic was released before the Society for Threatened Peoples became acquainted with the Armenian genocide. Over the years, not only in Germany, but happily also in the English-speaking space, more information in France as well. The dissertation about Arameans appeared. Whatever the generic term, but there's quite a lot. And if we speak about the two Bundestag resolutions, then to the anger of the Orthodox Greeks, the Syriacs are mentioned by their ethnonym as victims of this genocide, whereas the Greeks go under the anonymous term other Christians. And that has caused much protest, rightly so. But in general, what I today want to convey to you, the time has come not only to study the genocide during the First World War, or let's say before the massacres under Sultan Abdulhamid II. Whether we include this period as a 30 years genocide, Tana Aksham recently has said the genocidal period was from 1878 to 1924. Even larger period. But that is not the question. My interest is, what did it make with the survivors, the physical survivors of this genocide? What happened when they remained in Turkey, in this country where they could not openly live as members of a Christian denomination? What did that make with them? And what did it make with you in the diaspora, uprooted, and with all the problems that a diaspora situation brings with it, assimilation and so on? I think that will introduce a new period of genocide studies.
We have one more question.
more than a question, just an answer to the observation, the difference between tribal system, urban life. Sometimes we see Middle East from a Western perspective. This is why we use such concepts like something natural to the area. But in reality, there are 2 points that must be clarified in the sense of whether they were even living in big cities, but the clan idea, the pertains to a specific group, was even there in practice. So this one. Second, as Dr. Hofmann has underlined, the problem is we have been focusing only on the genocide, 1914, 1918. But our history is based on genocides, in reality, which are even in the 14th century, but especially under Bedr Khan back onward, in the middle of 19th century, they were in a massive way, they were slaughtered. So that we didn't have a time where we could build or rebuild. We have been always waiting, next year is coming again, and next 5 years are going to happen, and so on. So from 1843 onward, and then we have mentioned 1895, and then 1914, 1918, and 1926 that are not mentioned. And then the Cizre massacre is still there. So where our history is full of only such historical sad memoirs. So
I totally agree with you. That is another focus of future genocide research on the basis of Syriac experiences. What does it make with a group if they undergo repeated extermination experiences, if that is going on and on again? And if we watch not only the people concerned, but internationally, if we watch the de-Christianization of the Near East, which is under our eyes just going on now, what does it make with the people concerned? And I hope that future research will focus on these 2 topics.
Thank you very much, Tessa, for your input and contribution. Now, I would like to welcome our last presenter, Sanherib Ninos, from Frankfurt University, and he will present the Assyrian-Armenian genocide of World War I, memory, identity, and recognition of the same for in the European diaspora.
we will need a microphone. You need a microphone? Yeah.
Sorry, one moment, please.
Sanherib, if you want, we can start making a
Mahmoud,
presentation.
ja. Ja, genau. Ich gebe dir Bescheid. Shalom alaikum, shalom alaikum, marhaba, salam alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, it's both a privilege and a responsibility to address you today on a topic that sits at the intersection of historical trauma, memory, politics, and diasporic identity formation. Today, I will present on the long neglected topic of the Assyrian and Armenian genocide during the World War I and explore how this historical trauma has shaped and continues to shape the identity, memory, and the recognition politics of these communities in the European diaspora. Historical context and silence memory, first part. Between the World War I, over 200,000 Assyrians and Armenians, members of all Syriac churches, were killed in what survivors later first termed Farman decree, a parallel catastrophe to the better known Armenian and Greek genocides. The mass violence was systematically organized by the Ottoman regime and involved local Kurdish irregular militias, perpetrated often under the religious justification of jihad. Despite the scale of the atrocities, international acknowledgement has been limited until now. Treaties in the aftermath, such as Cizre and Lausanne, either marginalized or omitted these events, rendering the Assyrian-Armenian genocide an invisible genocide within the global memory of framework. What is particularly striking in the aftermath, however, is not solely the brutality of the violence, but the protracted silence that followed. Within families and communities, the trauma was neither mourned publicly nor integrated into communal or liturgical frameworks. The genocide became a social taboo. And this silence constituted an intergenerational rupture. Trauma was not transmitted as a narrative or memory, but as an absence, a haunting silence that fragmented historical knowledge and precluded structured forms of remembrance. As a consequence, for more than 70 years, the genocide remained largely unspoken, unrecognized by states, and omitted from dominant historical narratives. This long silence shaped the identity and historically self-perception of subsequent generations in profound ways. From the 1916s onwards, large waves of Assyrian and Armenian migrants resettled in Europe, primarily in Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Austria. These migrants, especially the third and fourth generation descents after genocide, often lack biographical memory of the genocide. Family stories are scarce or entirely absent. This generational amnesia is the result of multiple ruptures, linguistical dislocation, socio-cultural taboo, and a lack of institutional frameworks capable of supporting trauma articulation. Consequently, identity becomes disjoint, fragmented across the time and place,
with minimal historical depth. Migration to Western Europe due to continued persecution in the Middle East was not only a physical displacement, but also a rupture in cultural transmission. This generational amnesia is not accidental. It reflects broader socio-cultural taboos, linguistical ruptures, and the lack of communal frameworks for articulating trauma in host societies. What results is a diaspora community in which collective forms of memory are fragmented or absent altogether. Yet, beginning in the 1918s, we see the first step toward the emancipation of trauma. Pioneering publications such as Seifo by the booklet of Hasio Cicek, or later the book published by Gabriele Jonan, The Forgotten Holocaust, the book shared by Naman Karabashi, reprinted and translated, and this other booklet by David Gaunt, along with reprint. Yes, and we see here the first emancipation steps, 1974. The Assyrian National Movement has established a memory, a day of remembrance, and in 2015 we have also an official day of the remembrance of the Syriac Orthodox Church 100 years after the genocide. Today, diasporic identity within these communities often centers on the genocide, but in an abstract, decontextualized form. The term Seifo has become a symbolic reference for performing an identity, as I said, a Schicksalsgemeinschaft, a community of fate. Yet, they frequently lacks the personal stories and the biographical content that would give it the depth. As a result, we observe what I term a symbolic memory without substance, a condition where signifiers of trauma, such as a concept of victimhood or the word Seifo, are present, but without narratives, embodied content. The implication of this significant diasporic identity is often theorized as memory-based, a reconstruction of past loss. But in the case of Assyrian Aramean diaspora, we encounter a paradox. An identity that is deeply rooted in the notion of historical suffering, but one which lacks the narrative infrastructure to sustain it. Instead, identity is frequently asserted through abstract references to genocide and persecution, detached from the familial or local histories that typically constitute memory cultures. This leads to what I term symbolic memory without substance, a condition where the signifiers of trauma exist, the term of Seifo, the concept of victimhood, but are not accompanied by detailed narrative content. The lack of personalization is evident in music and testimony. We have here one example. Okay, this is one example The other is some music part, yeah, from... Yeah, it's okay. These examples are like the song or scattered oral histories reflect our longing for connection, but also pervasive detachment from lived memory. In recent years, memorials and monuments have begun to emerge across Europe in places such as Norrköping, Polheim, Locarno, Brussels. However, these commemorative sites, often marginalized, physically isolated or culturally peripheral. They are not integrated into school curricula or national discourses. According to Jan Assmann's concept of cultural memory, memory requires ritual, institutional, and textual support. At present, such support remains rudimentary in most diaspora communities. One of the few remaining vehicles of cultural memory within the diaspora is the erection of the public monuments and memorials like this. Cultural memory, as theorized by Jan Assmann, requires the institutional support, ritualized practices, and the textual stabilization. In our case, all three dimensions remain rudimentary. However, my research indicates that these monuments, though symbolically important, often occupy marginalized and inconspicuous spaces in urban landscapes. They are rarely integrated into school curricula, public discourses, or national commemorative practices. There's no canonized SAFO narratives that connects the third and fourth generation to their ancestral trauma. The memory landscape is fragmented with a few scattered monuments, but little cohesive narrative infrastructure. Some examples from Stuttgart and Gütersloh. No, it's Paris and Gütersloh in 2015. We talked about the resolution. Yes. Recognition and the politics of memory remains a central demand among diaspora activists. It is seen as a form of symbolic reparation and pathway toward communal healing. However, several obstacles hinder progress. Political sensitivities, especially around the Kurdish participation in the genocide, have complicated public discourse. Moreover, the Assyrian Armenian communities lack the lobbying power necessary to compete in the global memory economy. While the German Bundestag has issued resolutions acknowledging the genocide, explicit references to the Assyrian Armenian genocide are often omitted or euphemistically generalized. Qualitative interviews with the young people of Assyrian Armenian descent conducted in Germany reveal varying levels of awareness. Some express clear knowledge of SAFO, more or less. Other references victimhood, but cannot link it to family narratives or locations. Here are some examples of the qualitative narrative interview response. 4 examples. بوسايف قطلة لن أتركوي وأقردوي كدعينا أميدانو كدعينا قطلة أجدو نيدن إلو أيدر بوهاوي وسيفو لكدعينا وقطلة شوعمو همشي ألف ومبعا ميدن كل على كتوين نمشي حوي. Third, وبابو جدي قطلبا بقريثو عافلنا بخيانة. And fourth, قشتي محكيوة لن أتشعياوثو علو فرمان إيلو طعيناني بابي محكيوة أيدر بوآتي عم جدي لسوريا. These answers shows the connection, but only the latent way of continuity to narrative genocide. Conclusion. The memory of the genocide remains strikingly fragmented in a diasporic conscious. Absence of a canonized narrative, particularly among the third and fourth generations. While individuals and institutions now frequently invoke the term SAFO, the historical substance behind it remains elusive for many, especially for those born into the diaspora. Efforts to establish memorials or monuments in Europe, though symbolically significant, have been largely isolated and unevenly distributed. These initiatives represent fragmented expressions of identity rather than the emergence of a collective mnemonic infrastructure. Without rituals, institutionalized commemorations, or curricular integration, remembrance remains sporadic and symbolic rather than pedagogically embedded or socially anchored. To conclude, the Assyrian-Aramean diaspora in Europe represents a case of traumatized identity without collective memory. The genocide, though foundationally, has not been culturally internalized in a coherent or narrativized manner. What remains is a fragmented landscape of memory, faint personal traces, isolated memorials, and a generalized discourse of victimhood. If we are to move beyond this impasse, future generations must be equipped not only with the language of historical injustice, but also with the stories, names, and spaces that give it human form. We must ask ourselves, what does it mean to remember a genocide when the memory has not been passed down? And how can identity be sustained when the cultural infrastructure of memory remains so thin? These questions must shape our scholarly inquiry moving forward, if not for us, then for those who come after us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanherib. So,
Thank you, dear Sanherib, for this presentation. Can you switch one slide before that? Because I think I disagree with you in one point. Genocide is known but not narratively or culturally embedded. We have 3 memorial days in the year: 24th of April, 15th of June, and 7th of August.
Yeah.
And then for the music perspective, as an expert here in round, I can confirm that we have a lot of songs, poems who have a context to Seifo. So, and we have a lot of conferences, the last one before 10 years here, but I'm sure that between that there were also some other conferences. So what do you mean with that? It's not culturally embedded.
Yeah, it's okay. Low microphone.
Go to the microphone.
Yeah, you need the microphone.
Okay, I will stay next to you.
Thank you, Abud. Of course, you are right. We have more than identified 35 songs of Seifo, of course. Mimre, a lot of Mimre, yeah, of course. But what I'm talking about is the communal structures. No? The form of performing identity narrative, the genocide, there's a lack, an emptiness of this. It's only partly made of some diaspora groups, like in Sweden, in the city of Norrköping or Göteborg, but it's not an organized way, a structural way. And it's very important to have these structures and these frameworks we are talking about, and this is the lack of this made acknowledgement and a remembrance very, very thin. This is what I mean.
Yeah, Claudia, for this input and also the call for a more inclusive remembrance of the cipher, but I can't help but to mention a few points how, first of all, I believe can be traced back to this fragmented memory, collective memory, and these all stem from a certain way of how knowledge production is conducted in imperial worlds, where we have a Eurocentric knowledge production, which is very hegemonial, with a singularity of certain massacres, genocides being remembered, and the same patterns being applied to the whole world, and other narratives just can't fit it and be included. I would trace this back to this structure, and also having been remembering the cipher also includes to see or to call for a collective memory would also include to see the current situation, the ongoing continuity of persecution of Assyrians in the homeland, whereas in Syria during Daesh and Iraq, or right now in this volatile situation where we're having sectarian massacres with a potential threat again to our very existence in our homelands. And there I can't help but to again call for a much more precise analysis of imperial structures, supremacist views who try to exclude us from our homelands, and as Naudes Aklo mentioned in her work, Hostages in the Homeland, where she has been very detailed describing the diasporan Assyrian communities. I believe the othering of us, to believe that we are not indigenous to these regions and alienated ourselves from the discourse over there, is a very crucial point we should maybe work on. And Bartuma also mentioned yesterday the crisis management and the resilience we should be careful about, because this is not just history to remember, but also a call of action to analyze and to monitor the current situation and the survival in the homeland. Yeah, thank you. This is more a comment than a question.
One more input or two more.
Okay. Sanherib, thank you very much for a very...
I will give the floor later to you. I will take Nicholas first.
Okay.
Al-Jeloo.
Thank you very much for a very interesting perspective on the modern repercussions of the genocide among the descendants of survivors. I mean, my grandfather, my father's father, was 9 years old at the time of the genocide. He was born in 1906, and he experienced it. He was an eyewitness. But I only heard very basic things from my father or from my aunts about what they heard from him, and it was just very basic things, and you know, it's not even a proper narrative. No, so it's very important, but I think it also reflects our own social structures, which are very disorganized, and the fact that even after the genocide we kept being persecuted. I mean, we never had a significant period where we could actually breathe and reflect on what had happened to us. And unfortunately, most of our social, let's say, structured organizations have been really religious. And a lot of them have kowtowed or pandered to Middle Eastern governments in order for us to be able to remain in the Middle East and survive. And so this narrative is always pushed away and put under the carpet. What is your take on the activities of political parties, let's just say ethnic political parties and associations in the diaspora since the 1990s, and especially, let's just say, Safer Center and their activities, especially with over the last few months, the introduction of the Assyrian genocide into the curriculum of Arizona and Illinois and hopefully maybe California.
Okay, I will take.
Okay. Then I come back.
And then I will give the floor.
In line with what Al-Jeloo has underlined, I think we have to be positive in relation, even it's a scant work that has still been done, but if you analyze the movements now at the political level, you know, at the community level, we are becoming more and more conscious of what safe or Ferman is. Until a few decades, it was a taboo, and now, from an academic point of view, from a political point of view, now we have the erection of so many monuments, not only in Europe, but even in the United States. Last time I was in Arizona, and it was, you know, officially declared that the Syrian genocide is recognized by the US in all states. So but what we like, and this is what the new generation, you, Nicholas, and so on, must start working in an organized and professional way, is to provide the people with data, with lectures. So what we have to do is to focus on what is needed. We can't count on the religious part, as it has been said. They are limited to say, the last time it was the patriarch of the Chaldean church, when he was in Turkey, he denied it. Yeah. So, but the same thing happened with the Syriac Orthodox patriarch in a way that they don't recognize it, because their policy is another one. So let's depend on us in order to do a serious work, and let for the next generation a solid basis in order to know what happened to the Assyrian communities around those regions and what we can do in order to avoid it.
Now, I disagree, so you excluded yourself from the new generation, so you are still young.
Okay, Sanherib, please.
Thank you for the comments, thank you for the question. You are absolutely right, both, Nicholas. Yeah, we have to, what I wanted to show in my field, or my research field, is elementary for the young generations in the diaspora. And based on this qualitative narrative interview method, it became evident, and I want to emphasize that the generations born or raised in diaspora possesses minimal biographical memory of the family's experiences, like you said, during the genocide. In many cases, then these younger generations report no transmitted narratives or personal accounts, no names, no places, no specific losses. And this silence of the survivor generation seems to have passed down not as a content, but as absence. And this lack, this vacuum, this emptiness is a problem. Yeah? Here we see a paradoxon, of course, ambiguity. The efforts of the national social organized organizations, they are, but how is the impact to collective, to have canonized narrative? And this is the thing, what I mean, Abud. This is the thing, the important thing. Yeah, like I said, I had conducted 70 interviews, and the answer was so thin. It was the same way. We know, we lose, we know SAFO, we know everything, we know about it, but how, which one, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, I don't know, there's no storytelling. This is a big problem, to forget the issue of the genocide.
Okay, we give an applause for Sanherib. We end this session. Thanks for your attendance. We will do a break. 11:30 sharp, we will go there again. Thank you.